Think of French traditional music, and what probably springs to mind is waltzers, accordions, and singers such as Edith Piaf. If there's such a thing as a French equivalent of Irish jigs and reels, you could be forgiven for not knowing much about it. I recently set out to answer these two questions. Is there indeed such a thing as French fiddle music? And if so, how come it's such a well-kept secret? To find some answers, I look at a bit of French history and culture and show how the folk revival of the 1970s has led France down a very different path to that of England, Ireland or Scotland. France is a huge country compared to the UK, and up until the time of Napoleon, its different regions were poorly linked by roads and had little culturally in common. Local dialects and languages were widely spoken, such as Breton in the northwest and Occitan in the south. It's said that before 1800, 3/4 of the population spoke little or no French. There was a rich and diverse traditional folk culture, music, song and dances, but it was split up into distinct and separate areas. Béarn, for example, is a region in the southwest corner of France, on the Atlantic coast and bordering with Spain. The Basque language is spoken, and there's a distinctive fiddle tradition, with the most common dances being the saut or jump and the brawl, whose translation into English is unfortunate to say the least. The saut is particularly interesting, a long and complicated dance made of different sections, each of a specific length, perhaps comparable to an Irish set dance. The fiddle is traditionally played with accompaniment from a second musician who plays both a simple pipe and a tambourin de Béarn, actually a type of psaltery played one-handed with a stick to provide rhythm and a drone. One of the most influential fiddlers today in Béarn and leader of the band Adaron is Thomas Baudouin. I asked him about French regional culture, and he explained how since Napoleon's time the government in Paris has tried to centralise the country and eradicate the old cultural boundaries. France, he said, is a hyper-centralised country based on a meeting of a multitude of culturally rich regions with strong identities. These areas have their own languages, very different from the French, and they carry a very strong identity. They were always linked to a territorial division from the French monarchy with its duchies and counties. In the French Revolution of 1789, Paris created départements to break the territorial logic and impose French as the only official language of the Republic. With industrialisation and improving transport links in the 19th century, the French language began to be more commonly used, but in rural areas traditional music and dance persisted and even thrived. In the French Alpine region, known as Dauphiné, they had long been accustomed that fiddle players were essential for dancing. The most characteristic dance in this region is the rigodon, a simple 2/4 dance in two sections, and Alpine fiddlers were sometimes known as rigodonistes. The peak of the fiddle's popularity here came in the late 19th century, and in the town of Gap a violin association was formed to organise an annual fiddle contest which ran for 12 years in all. In its second year, in 1879, it was reported that the crowd was great and the stampede that followed disturbed the course of the dance contest. The part of France whose music is best known outside the country is Brittany. Here the fiddle was popular, particularly in the east of the region, and it was traditionally used to lead wedding processions, though it is the biniou or bagpipe and the bombarde, similar to an oboe, which are best known today. Distinctive dance tune types include andro, hantadro and gavotte. One of the best known fiddlers is Christian Lemaitre, known among other things for his work with the Celtic Fiddle Festival. Brittany is perhaps the one part of France whose regional culture is, and always has been, sufficiently strong that it was able to resist the centralising force of Paris. The region began to organise its traditional music and dance as early as the beginning of the 20th century, with the formation of a body called Blanc Brog in 1905 and Cercle Celtique in 1917. Brittany's distinct cultural identity has played a key role in ongoing campaigns for Breton nationalism. Most traditional musicians began by copying Irish music, but they realised the importance of avoiding Irish ornamentation and repertoire when playing for dancers, of which there are several in the region, including cavotte, andro and larriday. The fest no, a cross between a barn dance and a mini folk festival, has become a widespread feature of the local culture. Pierrick Lemieux is a leading Breton fiddler, and besides playing in the local style, he is also familiar with Irish, Cajun and Quebecois music. He told me, General de Gaulle said, "It is very difficult to govern France, a country with 300 different kinds of cheese." It's the same with traditional French music, too much diversity. Traditional music from Limousin is different to the music of Provence, and this is true with the fiddlers in the north or south of France too. There are too many different repertoires and interpretations. The 20th century saw a rise in local interest in regional culture in Brittany. Across most of France, however, the period marked the beginning of the decline of traditional music and fiddle playing. New dances were coming in, the waltz, the foxtrot and the java, and increasingly American jazz. The accordion also spread like wildfire. It had a louder and much more complete sound than the fiddle. Central France had been another stronghold of fiddle music, with the Auvergne having a particularly rich tradition. Fiddlers played along with two other instruments, the hurdy-gurdy, the vielle or wheel fiddle, and a bagpipe called the cabrette. The most common dance in this region is the bourrée. These can be in 2/4 or 3/4 time. In Auvergne, 3/4 dominates. Throughout the 19th century, there was a constant stream of migrants from still rural central France up to Paris, where the industrialization was creating many jobs. In the early 20th century, the area around the Bastille became a home from home for Auvergnats, and the Rue de Lappe was packed with cafes and bars where traditional music and dance could be enjoyed. At first, the music heard in these dance houses or bal musette would have been on the traditional instruments, the bagpipe, fiddle and hurdy-gurdy. However, the owner of one of the most popular clubs, Antoine Bousquetel, saw the writing on the wall when the first accordion showed up at his club in 1903. He said to his friend, "The days of my bagpipes are numbered, and your hurdy-gurdy too. This character with his accordion carries with him our ruin. It is a revolution on the way, do you hear? It is a complete orchestra, this instrument of the devil. It takes the breath out of you, this accordion of Satan." As the accordion gradually replaced the cabrette and vielle, the music evolved into what became known as bal musette, and the venues were known by the same name. This sound was to become the core of what we now think of as typical French music. Some Parisian Auvergne fiddle players, such as Joseph Perrier, played in duos or groups with accordionists, while others such as Eugène Amblin abandoned their instrument and took up accordion instead. Many more stopped playing completely or did so only for their own enjoyment. By the 1940s, traditional music was all but dead in most of France, and during the war the ultra-right Vichy government further hastened its demise by clumsily trying to force folk music on the people as a symbol of national solidarity. It was not until the 1960s that there was any revival of interest in folk music, and initially this was merely a reaction to the American and British folk revivals. One of the first folk clubs in Paris was the American Centre for Students and Artists, formed in the mid-1960s. Here you could expect to hear poor imitations of Bob Dylan or Joan Baez, but little in the way of French music. Things changed in May 1968. The date means little to us in England, but in Paris the students manned the barricades and staged the closest thing to a revolution since 1789. The imposition of centralized cultural ideas was one of the targets of this student uprising, and it had far-reaching consequences for music as well as politics. May 68 is an event and a date in France that marks the transition from one era to another. It is an essential historical marker for the history of 20th century France. May 68 says no for all the youth of France to values they deemed outdated, values related to war, colonialism, productivism, social success, and in the process, the way of looking at the old French provinces and traditions, including music and ancient instruments. The folk movement was relaunched as musique traditionnelle. Anglo-Saxon models were ditched, and traditional music became overwhelmingly an expression of regional identity. Through the 1970s, the idea spread rapidly that traditional music for the French only made sense if musicians concentrated on the tunes, styles and dances of their own region. Fiddlers such as Jacques Baudouin in Béarn, Pat Mazelier in Dauphiné, and Jean-Francois in the Auvergne began scouring the countryside for surviving fiddlers from the previous generation, and in many cases were able to record and transcribe the repertoires of some wonderful old players. Patrick Mazelier, a fiddle player, ethnomusicologist and author of an excellent book on the local fiddle style, explained the huge divide between the concepts of local and national culture. There is a great antipathy of the state towards regional identities and minority languages. The only traditional French music is its regional music, but this is not recognised as real music, but as folklore, a pejorative word in France. The work of these cultural militants has formed a sound foundation for what is now a thriving traditional music scene in many parts of France. Following the example of its Celtic cousins, Brittany was first off the mark with the organisation of festivals, such as the huge one in Lorient, but there are now traditional festivals large and small throughout the country. Which brings us back to the second of my initial questions. Why, despite the presence of bands, recordings, clubs, festivals and so on, all dedicated to traditional music, has there been so little international profile for this music? One problem is that throughout France the traditional music has stayed firmly bound up with dance. Most musicians I have talked to consider the primary aim of the music to keep dancers on their feet. With a few exceptions, such as Jean-Francois Vrod's trio violon, French traditional music has not, unlike in the UK and Ireland, evolved into concert music. As such, it's far less marketable beyond its own small area. How well would Planxty have done as a ceilidh band? Secondly, despite the brief period I mentioned of fiddle contests in Dauphiné, there is no tradition today of music contests. Whilst personally I find the idea of competition in music questionable, there is absolutely no doubt that in America, at fiddle conventions and old-time music gatherings, in Ireland at the Feis, and in Scotland at the Mod, contests have been immensely useful in fostering a culture of instrumental virtuosity. Whilst in France there are many first-rate dance fiddlers, there is no Martin Hayes, no Ali Bain, and no Mark O'Connor. Finally, the fact that traditional French music is fractured into 10 or so different regions makes the practicalities of promotion a huge problem. Whilst Paris has become a powerhouse for recording and promoting world music, particularly that originating in its former colonies, there is little interest or incentive to record and promote artists representing the jigsaw of French traditional music. Without political independence, the regions do not have sufficient clout to promote themselves abroad in a meaningful way. And is there any movement among French traditional musicians to create something which could be easily marketed, a national style or a pan-French folk movement? Absolutely not. Here's a final quote from Jacques Baudouin. France is the crucible of multiple migrations from the east, north, south, and even by Vikings from the west. This is what makes our wealth, but it precludes any notion of national culture. It would make no sense. How to unify the Breton culture, cultures of the Occitan, Catalan, Alsace? You might as well marry an elephant with a penguin.